Hello, government students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 13, Section 4, Local, State, and Federal Courts. So we're going to talk a little bit about this thing called jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is this idea of having the power or authority to kind of listen to or decide a case. There are different types of jurisdiction. There is one that is known as general jurisdiction, which applies to state and local courts. It's basically to have that jurisdiction over a wide variety of different types of cases. But more often is the case that we're going to talk about original jurisdiction. And this is going to be the original trial court that's going to hear this case for the first time. Okay. There are some courts that have this. Matter of fact, even the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction, but it has to happen with some really specific cases. So if we have a situation where two states or two or more states are in a lawsuit and they are suing one another, then our Supreme Court becomes kind of like a trial court and it will have original jurisdiction. But more often is the case is that original jurisdiction is going to happen at your federal district level. That would be in Nebraska, like our federal district courthouses in Lincoln and Omaha. There are other types of jurisdictions. There's limited jurisdiction. This applies only to the federal courts. This is the authority to basically authority limited to cases involving federal law or the U.S. Constitution. So when we talk about like state issues, limited jurisdiction would not apply to that. Okay. Appellate jurisdiction, this is kind of dealing with the concept of appealing. This is like our appeals court. And sometimes our Supreme Court acts as a court of appeals. It is actually, the Supreme Court is like the last court of appeal that you can actually plead to. This has the authority to decide appeals cases by all means. So when we talk about our federal district courts, there are basically three levels. There are federal district court rooms or courthouses throughout the United States. Nebraska has two of these, one in Omaha, one in Lincoln. States like California have multiple federal district courts, and part of that is because of their vast population. They need several courthouses to kind of meet the needs of their people. Above that are federal courts of appeal for our state, for Nebraska. Our federal appeals court or appellate court is not even in our state. It's actually in Kansas City at the federal courthouse down there. And then finally, at the very top of this is our Supreme Court. There's only one, and it's located in Washington, D.C. And so this is kind of the process of how cases would move up through the system. So some of the powers of our federal courts. The federal courts derive their power from the U.S. Constitution and federal laws, whereas when we look at like our states, when you talk about where do they derive their power, it's always from state constitutions and state laws. Federal courts have jurisdictions in cases that involve federal laws. That would include things like treaties, issues with foreign nations, and the interpretation of Constitution or bankruptcy. Federal and state courts both have jurisdiction. When they both have jurisdiction, they have what is known as concurrent jurisdiction. A trial court is said to have original jurisdiction. Persons who lose a case in a trial court can take that case all the way to an appellate court. The Supreme Court has both original and appellate jurisdiction. And finally, the Supreme Court cannot initiate action into a lawsuit. In other words, the Supreme Court cannot sue somebody else. They are kind of beyond that or above that by all means. So in the lower federal courts, who hears these cases and the jurisdiction and the number of courts? In the federal district court, we have basically two types of jury. We have a grand jury and a petit jury. Okay, grand juries are a little different than petit juries. Petit juries are probably what you're more familiar with. It's a situation where you might have 12 people that act as jurors, and you have a defense attorney and maybe a prosecuting attorney, and they have their day in court with witnesses and such. But a grand jury is actually quite different. It's basically has a purpose of determining whether or not there's enough evidence to proceed with a petit jury. So in some cases, when we talk about like serious crimes like murders and such, there will usually be a grand jury that's going to be called up. And this is not so much at the federal level as it is at the state level. But a grand jury is going to get together, and what they're going to look at is whether or not there's enough evidence to proceed with having this court case, to see whether or not we need to have this trial. Grand juries at the federal level usually are used for things like in Nebraska. It's actually used to help determining the outcomes of tribal law. So, for example, when we talk about our Indian reservations, they have their own system of law, their tribal law, and they need an appeal system for that. And the grand jury kind of works a little bit in that process. But in many cases, it's determining, again, whether or not there's enough evidence to proceed with the court case. Jurisdiction. Uh, for the most part, the jurisdiction is dealing with cases that involve federal issues or federal questions. It deals with federal statutory law or constitutional law. And as far as number of courthouses, there are 94 federal district court houses in the United States. Nebraska has 2, but these are basically based on the population and the needs of the people within a certain geographic area. As far as federal courts of appeal, there's a panel of 13 judges that sits on this federal court of appeal. Jurisdiction is appellate. It's all about appeals. And the 13th court has what we call national jurisdiction, which basically applies beyond just one little region, but the whole nation, and probably also looking into territories. There are only 13 courts. Nebraska is in what we call the 8th Circuit, and that 8th Circuit is headquartered out of Kansas City, and that's where our courtroom is. When we talk about look up here, we've got a kind of a diagram of a petit jury where they look at the evidence, whereas a grand jury, you have a panel of people that are working together. They might get to ask questions of attorneys and look at testimony and things of that nature. For the most part, all they're determining is whether or not there's enough information there to proceed with a real court case. All right, other federal courts. And number one, we have legislative courts that help Congress exercise their power. In 1982, Congress established a claims court to handle claims against the U.S. for money damages. We have circuit courts of appeal for the federal circuit that hear appeals from the claims courts. We have cases that come to the U.S. Tax court from citizens who don't agree with the IRS rulings about their federal taxes that they had to pay. We also have courts for the armed forces for appeals. Typically, when a service person has committed a crime, it is going to be a military court that's going to hear that case. The Court of Armed Forces Appeals is basically the appeal system for that, for those military courts. And then there's also territorial courts for U.S. territories like the Virgin Islands, Guam, Northern Marianas, Puerto Rico. They hear those kind of things. It is possible that those territorial courts, if those appeals have to go all the way to the Supreme Court, then it would go to that distance. All right. The president, with the advice and consent of the Senate, appoints all federal judges. When President Kennedy was elected in 1960, the Democratic Congress immediately passed a new omnibus judgeship, which basically did this, and it probably made Republicans really upset. It created 71 new federal judge positions for the president to fill. And the deal was that Kennedy was probably going to appoint judges that kind of shared his liberal mindset. Okay, because the judges are appointed for life, the president views these judicial appointments as opportunities to perpetuate really their political ideologies after they leave the White House. Because a lot of times these judges are going to be sitting there for a decade or more after they leave the White House. And then under the senatorial courtesy practice, a president will submit a name for a judicial appointment to the senators from that candidate state. And what they get to do is they get to basically put in their 2 cents about whether or not they think this appointment is going to be good before it's formally submitted for the full Senate approval. All right. Thank you very much.